A North Vietnamese Army general stood over a map table in a cave complex inside Phuoc Tuy Province and read the report a second time, then a third. His Recon company, 32 trained soldiers whose job was to find the enemy before the enemy found them, had simply ceased to exist. Not in a pitched battle, not under an artillery strike, not beneath the rotors of helicopter gunships. The after-action summary from his surviving subordinates offered an explanation so humiliating that the general refused to enter it into the official record. 5 men, 5 Australians had done this. He crumpled the paper, dropped it on the table, and told the officer who delivered it that the report was wrong, that his men had encountered a company-sized ambush, that there had been air support, that there must have been something. Because the alternative, the factual truth sitting right there in that report, was a thing he simply could not accept. His Recon company, men who had spent years learning to become invisible in these very jungles, had been hunted and killed by a patrol smaller than a cricket team, and they had never once seen who was doing it. Stay with me. Because what those 5 men were doing in the jungle north of Nui Dat, the methods, the psychology, the terrifying patience it required, was so far outside the boundaries of conventional warfare that even the soldiers executing it sometimes struggled to explain it. American liaison officers who observed Australian SAS operations in Phuoc Tuy Province sent back reports that used words like unsettling and unprecedented. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army had a simpler word, Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and they didn't use it as a compliment. They used it the way people use the names of things they cannot explain and cannot stop. To understand why a North Vietnamese general found the truth unbelievable, you have to understand what kind of soldiers the Australians actually were by the time they arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966. Not what they looked like, because they looked terrible by any conventional military standard, but what they had become through a lineage of hard fighting in environments that punished every assumption of Western warfare. The Australian SAS regiment was barely a decade old when its first squadron touched down at Vung Tau in April 1966. But the knowledge those men carried was far older. It stretched back through the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo, where Australian and British SAS patrols conducted secret cross-border operations through some of the most unforgiving jungle terrain on Earth. It stretched back through the Malayan Emergency, where a decade of fighting communist insurgents through equatorial rainforest had generated a doctrine built on patience, silence, and the radical idea that in the jungle, the side that moves slower usually wins. And it stretched back further still, to a body of knowledge that no military academy had ever codified, carried by men whose ancestors had been navigating hostile terrain for longer than most civilizations had existed. The Aboriginal trackers attached to Australian units in Vietnam, through a program the government would not publicly acknowledge for decades, represented the leading edge of a 40,000-year tradition of reading country. Private soldiers from Western desert communities who could determine the age of a footprint by the moisture content in disturbed soil, who could tell whether a man carrying a load was injured by the angle of his heel strike, who could detect the presence of humans through the silence of birds and the changed register of insects in the canopy above. These were not mystical abilities. They were intensely practical skills, refined through generations of necessity in landscapes that killed the careless. The Australians had embedded this knowledge directly into their operational doctrine, not as a curiosity, but as a weapon, At the Jungle Training Centre in Canungra, Queensland, the Australian Army had been systematically developing jungle warfare methodology since the Second World War. The lessons of Kokoda, where Australian infantry had fought Japanese forces through terrain so brutal it broke the bodies of men who survived the bullets, had burned a particular philosophy into Australian military culture. Firepower was not enough. Speed was frequently fatal. The jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was an environment to be mastered, and mastery required transformation, not technology. When 3 Squadron SASR arrived in Vietnam in June 1966 as the first Australian SAS unit in country, they brought all of this with them. Their operating model was built around the 5-man patrol, small enough to move without detection, large enough to generate decisive firepower on contact and extricate safely. They operated on 10-day average patrol cycles, sometimes extending to 3 weeks when intelligence required it. They communicated by radio in brief, scheduled transmissions that minimized their electronic signature. They ate indigenous food and abandoned Western hygiene products 2 weeks before insertion, so their bodies stopped advertising their presence on the wind. They wore Ho Chi Minh sandals, tire rubber footwear identical to standard Viet Cong equipment, so that any tracks they left would read as friendly movement to enemy scouts. They moved at speeds American observers routinely described as operationally absurd, 100 to 200 meters per hour through primary jungle, pausing every few steps to listen, smell, and watch. An entire day of movement might cover a single kilometer. This was not caution born of timidity. It was caution born of absolute clarity about what the jungle rewarded and what it punished. American units moving at 2 to 3 kilometers a day generated disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters, snapped branches, rustled undergrowth, the subtle vibrations that moved through root systems like low-frequency radio. Viet Cong listening posts, positioned along known patrol routes, had been cataloging these signatures for years. They could count a patrol's approximate size by the footfall pattern. They could estimate its direction and pace. They could prepare a killing zone and have their men in position before the approaching patrol had any idea it was walking into a funnel. Against the Australians, these techniques produced nothing. A patrol moving at 100 meters per hour left no detectable signature. The jungle closed behind each step before the next one was taken. The soundscape recovered completely. Birds kept calling. Insects kept their rhythm. Monkeys continued their commentary in the canopy. There was nothing to report, nothing to investigate, nothing to place an ambush against. The Australians were not moving through the jungle. They were dissolving into it. In 6 years of operations in Vietnam, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, with 106 more probable. Their own losses over that entire period: 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 28 wounded. By the mathematics of the war, those numbers constitute something close to a miracle. By the logic of Australian SAS doctrine, they constitute the predictable outcome of a system working exactly as designed. The system worked because it inverted the assumptions of the enemy. The Viet Cong and NVA were extraordinarily skilled at setting ambushes. They had studied American and South Vietnamese movement patterns until they could predict route selections, insertion points, resupply schedules, and the timing of reactions to contact. Against forces that moved predictably, used fixed helicopter landing zones, and responded to contact by immediately calling for fire support and air assets, the ambush was nearly an art form. You knew what your prey would do. You shaped the ground accordingly. You waited. The Australians destroyed this calculus at every step. Their insertion helicopter would drop them kilometers from their actual area of operations, specifically to defeat any enemy monitoring of landing zones. They moved to their patrol area on foot, arriving from directions the enemy had no reason to anticipate. They selected ambush positions not based on where trails crossed open ground, the obvious choice, but based on detailed reading of the terrain, the vegetation, and the patterns of use. An experienced SAS scout could look at a jungle trail and determine which sections saw regular traffic, how recently, in which direction, and by how many men, without leaving his concealed position. The ambush would be laid not at the most convenient spot, but at the spot where the enemy would least expect it, approached from the direction that minimized any chance of detection, at the time that intelligence suggested was optimal. And then they would wait. For hours, for a day, for however long the intelligence indicated was necessary. Without movement, without sound, without the small behavioral signals, the unconscious shifts, the suppressed coughs, the adjusted grips, that human beings generate when their bodies and minds begin registering boredom or discomfort as problems to be solved. Australian SAS selection had filtered for men who could exist in a state of absolute sensory alertness without fidgeting, without the normal restlessness of human consciousness. The psychological literature that would eventually study these capacities called it predatory patience. The Australians who possessed it called it, less grandly, just waiting. When contact came, the five-man patrol did not fight a five-man battle. It fought a battle designed to appear vastly larger. Australian SAS contact drills, the immediate action sequences that governed the first seconds of an engagement, were built around saturating the enemy's perceptions with noise, muzzle flash, and fragmentation from multiple directions simultaneously. The shortened L1A1 self-loading rifle, barrel cut to eliminate snagging in dense vegetation, and increase maneuverability at the close ranges where jungle engagements actually occurred, typically under 30 meters, often under 15, delivered 7.62 millimeter rounds that stopped men rather than merely wounding them. Claymore mines, carefully positioned in the preceding hours, added overlapping kill zones that no five-man force should have been able to generate. The noise was catastrophic and directionally confusing. Enemy soldiers who survived the initial burst consistently reported encountering a much larger force. A platoon, a company, sometimes more. Then the Australians were gone. Before the initial shock had time to convert into organized pursuit, before reinforcements could be called and positioned, before any coherent response was possible, the patrol had already broken contact and begun its extraction, moving at the only speed that guaranteed continued invisibility, very, very slowly. The NVA after-action reports that were captured during and after the war described this experience with a consistency that bordered on the obsessive. Enemy units entering areas where Australian SAS had been operating reported a specific kind of deteriorating awareness. Couriers failed to arrive. Sentries were found dead with no evidence of any sound having been heard by adjacent positions 15 meters away. Movement that left minimal trace. Positions that had been used safely for months suddenly becoming death traps with no warning and no explanation. One captured enemy operational log entry recovered from a unit operating in the border regions of Phuoc Tuy Province, reads with the unmistakable texture of collective disorientation. Patrols are being restricted to daylight. The commander believes the jungle itself has become hostile. The jungle had not become hostile. 5 Australians had been living in it for 2 weeks. In late 1968, a North Vietnamese army formation, elements of units, including the 33rd NVA Regiment, which would later become bitterly familiar to Australian infantrymen, was attempting to establish operational presence in the western and northern reaches of Phuoc Tuy Province. This was not a new ambition. The province had been contested since before the French had left. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion had operated from its mountain strongholds for years, but the NVA regulars now moving in represented something different. Regular army formations with the training, equipment, and command infrastructure of a conventional military force, sent south to reinforce a struggle that local units were no longer winning on their own. Before you commit regular formations to operations in contested territory, you send reconnaissance. You map the ground. You identify the enemy's patrol patterns, his listening posts, his artillery positions and their ranges, the routes that are used and the routes that are watched. You find his blind spots. Reconnaissance is not glamorous work, but it is foundational. An army that moves without it moves blind. The NVA Recon Company tasked with preparing the operational picture in western Fuaktui was composed of experienced soldiers. These were not raw conscripts pushed south through the Ho Chi Minh Trail's killing corridors. They were men who had survived multiple campaigns, who understood jungle movement, who had spent years developing the skills that kept reconnaissance soldiers alive in environments where the wrong step meant death. Their commander, whoever he was, had every reason to trust them with this mission. He had no reason to anticipate what was already in the jungle waiting for them. The Australian SAS Patrol operating in the area in this period, and here the historical record deals in confirmed patterns rather than individually documented incidents of this specific engagement, which remained in classified operational files, had been inserted quietly and had been watching for days before the enemy recon elements began their work. The Australians would have read the signs of their approach before the NVA soldiers themselves knew they were entering a sector under observation. The changed bird behavior, the freshness of disturbed vegetation on the approach tracks, the compression patterns of footprints that told a trained eye exactly who was moving, at what pace, and with what level of alertness. What followed would have unfolded in stages that looked, to anyone watching from a safe distance, like the jungle choosing its victims with terrifying deliberateness. Not a single engagement, but a series of precisely calibrated contacts spread across hours or days, each one isolated, each one terminating before the surviving enemy could organize a meaningful response, each one leaving the next NVA element to enter the area moving just a little more cautiously, just a little more slowly, just a little more aware that something was wrong without being able to identify what. The contact drills that Australian SAS had rehearsed to unconscious fluency would have been executed with the same explosive violence each time, the claymores detonating at optimal range, the controlled arcs of fire from multiple positions simultaneously, the 7.62 millimeter rounds doing what that round does at close range in jungle terrain, followed almost immediately by the deliberate breaking of contact and the slow, silent withdrawal before any coherent enemy response could materialize. By the time the reporting chain delivered its summary to the NVA commander responsible for this sector, the picture it painted was devastating. His recon company, the eyes that were supposed to prepare the ground for everything that followed, had been systematically dismantled across multiple engagements without ever establishing effective contact with the force responsible. No Australian casualties. No visual identification of the opposing force's size or composition. No coherent after-action description that could be used to plan a counter. Just dead men, in positions that should have been safe, killed by an enemy who appeared and disappeared as if the jungle itself had teeth. The commander read this report and rejected it. He had good reasons to reject it. Reasons that made perfect military sense if you had been trained in a tradition that recognized the limits of what small forces could accomplish. 32 trained reconnaissance soldiers did not simply cease to exist at the hands of 5 men. That was not how warfare worked. There must have been a larger Australian force operating in the area. There must have been supporting fires that his surviving men had failed to accurately report or attribute. There must have been something, helicopters perhaps, or a reaction force that had arrived unseen, because the factual alternative required accepting something his doctrine had no category for. He was not alone in this response. Captured enemy documents from across Phuoc Tuy Province's operational history return again and again to this same pattern of institutional disbelief followed, slowly, by a grudging recalibration. The Viet Cong East Zone Command, following the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, where 108 men of D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, killed 245 enemy soldiers from a force outnumbering them by nearly 20-1, issued orders forbidding its units from ambushing Australian formations without explicit command authorization. The explicit reasoning in those orders was that Australian units behaved unpredictably and engaged with a ferocity and precision that made the standard ambush calculus unreliable. You could not apply the rules that governed engagements with Americans to engagements with Australians. The rules were different, and learning the new rules was costing men. There is a specific moment in the psychology of warfare when a military force stops thinking about an enemy in purely tactical terms and begins thinking about them in something closer to mythological ones. It is the moment when the rational frameworks, the doctrines and assessments and intelligence summaries stop being sufficient to explain what is happening, when the patterns stop making sense by any logic available to the men experiencing them. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong reached this moment with the Australian SAS at different times and through different experiences, but they reached it. The term Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, or more precisely phantoms of the forest, was not coined by enemy commanders sitting safely in rear area headquarters. It emerged from the reports of men in the field, men trying to describe to their superiors a phenomenon that their training had given them no vocabulary for. These Australians did not fight like soldiers. They did not follow the patterns that defined every other Western force in country. They could not be smelled. They could not be heard. They could not be tracked. They were in positions where they could not logically be. And when they struck, the speed and violence of what happened bore no relationship to the numbers that should have been capable of producing it. The fear this generated was measurable in ways that went beyond the body counts. Viet Cong and NVA units that operated aggressively against American forces in adjacent sectors displayed markedly different behavior in Australian-controlled Phuoc Tuy. Their tempo of operations dropped. Their willingness to conduct night movement decreased. The number of small unit patrols, the basic currency of guerrilla warfare, fell sharply in areas where Australian SAS activity had been reported. Commanders who should have been pushing their men to find and fix the enemy were instead receiving reports of soldiers refusing to enter certain sections of jungle. not for tactical reasons, for reasons that had no place in a military assessment, because the jungle in those areas had begun doing things that jungle was not supposed to do. An enemy soldier captured in the Phuoc Tuy operations of this period told his Australian interrogators something that stuck in their institutional memory. When his unit had been given a patrol tasking that would take them through an area where Australian SAS were known to operate, the political officer had given a speech about revolutionary steadfastness and the inevitable victory of the people's struggle. The soldier had listened to this speech and then privately had prayed to his ancestors, not because he doubted the revolutionary cause, because his ancestors understood things about the forest that political officers did not. The Australians, for their part, understood precisely the psychological mechanism they were exploiting. The body display doctrine, positioning enemy dead, in ways that exploited Vietnamese cultural beliefs about the spiritual state of those killed without proper rites, was not casual cruelty. It was applied psychology, deliberate and calculated, using the available medium of the battlefield to send messages that no amount of conventional military pressure could deliver. The ace of spades tucked into the collar of a fallen enemy soldier was not a calling card. It was a transmission. We were here, we see you, and you never saw us. The 3 dead couriers, arranged against trees with their weapons across their laps, were not a display of contempt. They were a carefully composed communication to the next enemy element that arrived. Something was here that you cannot understand, and it will be here again. The numbers that the Australian SAS produced over 6 years of Vietnam operations were, by any measure, extraordinary. Nearly 1,200 patrols, 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 probable, 1 friendly killed in action across the entire combat tour. 1. The kill ratio those numbers represent, comparing the losses inflicted to the losses sustained, was the highest of any unit, Australian or Allied, in the entire Vietnam War. American military analysts who examined these figures in the classified assessments of the period consistently struggled with 2 responses that contradicted each other. The first response was professional. These results are remarkable and should be studied, replicated, and incorporated into American doctrine immediately. The second response was institutional. These results are inconsistent with American military culture, require methods that American forces are not structured or psychologically prepared to employ, and would require acknowledging that a force 1/60th the size of the American commitment had found a better way to fight. The institutional response, predictably, tended to win. General William Westmoreland, during a 1967 visit to the Australian Task Force at Nui Dat, described Australian operations as very inactive. The criticism stung, partly because it was so precisely wrong. Australian forces were operating continuously throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, with constant patrol activity, regular ambushes, and a tempo of intelligence gathering that was steadily degrading the enemy's ability to operate freely in the province. But their activity was invisible by the metrics American command used to measure progress: body counts, search and destroy sorties, helicopter utilization rates, artillery rounds expended. The Australians were generating none of these numbers in the quantities American commanders expected. They were achieving their effects through patience and precision rather than volume, and volume was the language that American commanders read. The Australian response to Westmoreland's criticism, delivered through official channels with remarkable diplomatic restraint, pointed to the actual indicators of operational effectiveness. the 70% reduction in enemy-initiated incidents in Phuoc Tuy between 1966 and 1969, the progressive dismantling of Viet Cong infrastructure in the province, the documented evidence from captured enemy materials that NVA and VC formations were actively avoiding Australian-controlled territory. By the measures that mattered in a counterinsurgency campaign, population security, enemy freedom of action, the relative safety of roads and villages, Phuoc Tuy Province was the most successfully pacified province in South Vietnam. The Australians were winning. They were just winning quietly, and quiet victories were hard to put in a briefing. The deeper story, the one that the Australian task force's results illuminated, but that American doctrine struggled to absorb, was about the relationship between force structure and effectiveness. 5 men who moved at 100 meters per hour and waited in silence for days before striking were accomplishing things that battalions of American infantry with helicopter gunship support and artillery on call were not. The reason was not bravery. American soldiers were not cowards, and no serious analysis has ever suggested they were. The reason was methodology. The American approach to jungle warfare treated the jungle as an obstacle, and the enemy as a target to be located and destroyed. The Australian approach treated the jungle as a medium, and the enemy as a problem to be understood and then exploited. An American unit entering a sector to conduct a search and destroy operation announced its presence from the moment its helicopter insertion began generating noise kilometers away. It moved at speeds that created audible signatures. It maintained radio contact that could be intercepted. It established landing zones that became predictable and therefore vulnerable. The enemy, sophisticated and patient, could track this approach, choose whether to engage or disappear, and manage the encounter on terms favorable to the smaller and more agile side. The Australian SAS patrol inserting into the same sector left no signature that an enemy could find. It moved to its target area by a route that no intelligence assessment could have predicted because it was chosen based on real-time reading of the terrain. It spent days observing before doing anything. When it acted from a position of total information dominance over a completely ignorant opponent. The engagement lasted seconds. The patrol was gone before the sound had finished echoing. This was not the same kind of warfare. It was a different kind of warfare entirely, and the NVA general who read his Recon company's destruction in a crumpled report and refused to believe it was experiencing, personally and viscerally, the cognitive gap between those two approaches. There is a dimension of this story that the statistics do not capture, and that the after-action reports only gesture toward obliquely. The transformation that turned Australian soldiers into 5-man hunting teams capable of operating for weeks in enemy-saturated jungle without detection was not a comfortable process, and it did not end when the tour ended. The psychological demands of sustained long-range reconnaissance at the level Australian SAS conducted it were categorically different from those of conventional infantry service, even conventional infantry service in a combat zone. The difference was not the violence. Conventional infantry experienced violence that was in many ways more sustained and more overwhelming. But the isolation, the hypervigilance, and the particular discipline of becoming genuinely invisible rather than merely cautious. To move at 100 meters per hour through jungle where enemy soldiers were operating meant suppressing every human impulse toward haste, every cognitive habit of forward planning, every social instinct toward communication. It meant existing in a state of pure sensory present tense for days at a time, processing environmental information with an intensity that left no cognitive space for anything else. Veterans of this experience have described it, in the decades since Vietnam, as a kind of radical reduction, the elimination of everything that was not immediately relevant to the question of survival in the next few seconds. The mind became very small and very fast. It registered things the untrained mind would not have noticed: the absence of a bird call, the wrong angle of a shadow, the faint organic scent of something that did not belong, and it responded to these signals automatically, without the delay of conscious deliberation. This state was effective. It was devastatingly effective. An Australian SAS trooper in this condition was something close to a perfect predator, operating in the environment at a level of integration that the enemy's sophisticated jungle skills could not reliably detect or defeat. But this state was not something that simply switched off when the extraction helicopter touched down and the patrol returned to Nui Dat. The neurological and psychological adaptations that produced it were not features that could be installed and uninstalled on a schedule. They were transformations. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually prove higher than those of their American counterparts, despite lower casualty rates and smaller numbers engaged. The explanation that military psychiatry has increasingly settled on points not to the violence itself, but to the particular character of the service, the extended isolation, the continuous high-threat environment without the psychological buffer of large unit membership, the hypervigilance that had been trained to an automatic level, and then had no safe environment in which to deactivate. The men who came home from Phuoc Tuy Province came home with nervous systems that had been recalibrated for a world that no longer existed around them, looking for signals in environments that contained none, still processing the silence of suburban streets as a potential threat signature. This is the hidden arithmetic of the kill ratios: 5 men, 1 friendly killed in action across 6 years, 492 enemy dead. The efficiency of those numbers is genuine, and the achievement they represent is real. But they do not account for the men who came home changed in ways that the war's end did not reverse, who spent decades navigating a civilian world that had no category for what the jungle had made them. In the operational documents captured from NVA and Viet Cong formations during and after the war, a pattern emerges that is both consistent and specific. The guidance issued by communist commanders for engaging Australian forces was qualitatively different from the guidance issued for engaging Americans. For American forces, the guidance was tactical and confident. American patrols were predictable. They could be heard from 300 meters away. Their smell preceded them by 500 meters in humid jungle air. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was completely alien to the forest environment and detectable at extraordinary distances by soldiers who had spent years learning to read their surroundings. American units used helicopter insertion, creating detectable sound signatures from kilometers away. American reactions to contact were standardized and therefore exploitable. Immediate call for fire support, withdrawal to defensible terrain, helicopter extraction. For a disciplined ambush team that knew how to shape the ground and time its withdrawal before artillery arrived, engaging Americans was a manageable risk with calculable returns. For Australians, the guidance took a different form. It was not tactical confidence. It was something closer to professional warning with undertones of genuine unease. capture documents described Australian patrols as extremely difficult to detect. They eliminated chemical signatures. They moved too slowly to create sound. Their counter-tracking techniques made trail following effectively impossible. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything encountered from other Western forces, and critically, the point that NVA and VC commanders returned to repeatedly in their guidance documents, their contact drills were so violent and so fast that attempting a conventional ambush against them was more likely to result in the ambush team's destruction than in the patrols. The recommended approach, stated explicitly in multiple capture documents, was avoidance. Do not attempt to engage Australian patrols. Do not attempt pursuit. Do not set ambushes in areas where Australians were known to operate. If contact was unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw to areas outside Australian operational sectors. One captured document, analyzing the difference between American and Australian operational behavior with the unsentimental clarity of a military professional who had been studying his opponents for years, noted that American sectors offered opportunities that Australian sectors did not. In American sectors, a guerrilla force could operate with reasonable confidence, strike, withdraw, and expect the Americans to behave predictably. In Australian sectors, the jungle itself was dangerous, regardless of what you did or how carefully you moved. You did not know where the Australians were, and this not knowing was itself debilitating. It forced every movement to be slow, every decision to be made with the awareness that something might be watching that you would never see. This was the strategic effect of the five-man patrol operating at 100 meters per hour. Not just the kills it accumulated, though those were significant, but the way it transformed the enemy's relationship with the terrain. Phuoc Tuy Province, which should have been a deep rear area for NVA and VC units operating against American formations to the north and west, became a place they moved through with the careful attention of men who knew they were being hunted by something they could not find and could not fight. When the last Australian SAS squadron completed its tour and withdrew from Vietnam in October 1971, they left behind a province that was measurably more secure than any comparable area under Allied responsibility. Enemy-initiated incidents in Phuoc Tuy had dropped dramatically from their 1966 levels. The NVA and VC main force units that had once operated with relative confidence in the province had been driven to the margins or forced into areas where Australian persistence kept them off balance and afraid to operate openly. This had been accomplished by a force that never exceeded a few thousand men, operating under their own command structure by their own doctrine, by methods that American military culture had systematically declined to learn from despite overwhelming evidence of their superiority. The American classified assessments of Australian SAS effectiveness produced in the early 1970s, distributed to fewer than 50 recipients and locked in archives for decades afterward, reached conclusions that made institutional sense of the Pentagon's reluctance to publicize them. The kill ratio of Australian SAS operations compared to everything else in the theater was not marginal. It was not explained by terrain, by enemy quality differential, or by the specific character of Phuoc Tuy Province. It was the product of a methodology that worked better than the American alternative. Acknowledging this publicly would have required acknowledging that 58,000 American dead had fallen in part because an alternative approach was available and not pursued. This was not information American institutional culture was prepared to disseminate. The lessons were eventually absorbed, but slowly, and with the friction of institutional resistance. The special operations reforms of the 1980s, driven in part by the catastrophic failure of Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, and the subsequent recognition that American special operations capability was profoundly inadequate, incorporated principles that Australian forces had demonstrated effective in Vietnam 15 years earlier: small unit operations, emphasis on intelligence over firepower, extended isolation capability, environmental integration, the understanding that a 5-man patrol that knows exactly where it is and what is around it can accomplish things that a battalion moving blind cannot. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the reconstituted Ranger battalions, the entire architecture of modern American special operations. It carries Australian DNA in ways that are rarely acknowledged because the original recipient of the lesson refused to receive it when it was being given freely and demonstrated conclusively in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy. The NVA general who refused to believe his recon company had been destroyed by 5 men was not stupid. He was applying rational analysis to a situation that his doctrine had not equipped him to understand. 5 men cannot do what 32 trained reconnaissance soldiers cannot stop. This is logical. This is consistent with everything he had been taught about the relationship between force size and tactical capability. It is wrong, but it is wrong in a way that required 5 years of accumulated evidence and a province full of dead recon soldiers before the logic finally gave way to the reality. American military institutions made the same error at a larger scale and a slower pace, and the cost was measured in lives rather than in damaged professional pride. The Australians were offering the lesson from 1966 onward. They were offering it plainly, through results that were impossible to misread if you were willing to read them. They taught at the Recondo School. They shared methodologies freely with American counterparts who asked. They conducted joint operations whose outcomes spoke with the eloquence that statistics possess. When they are so lopsided, they stop looking like statistics and start looking like argument. The jungle ghosts of Phuoc Tuy Province were 5 men at a time, rotating through a province that became theirs in the only way that matters in a counterinsurgency. The enemy became afraid to use it. They were not cowards who struck from hiding. They were the most professional soldiers in the theater, operating at the leading edge of what small unit capability could achieve when it was built on the right foundations: patience, adaptation, sensory discipline, and the willingness to become something other than a conventional soldier in an environment that rewarded everything except conventional soldiering. A North Vietnamese general crumpled a report and called it wrong. Somewhere in the jungle outside his command post, 5 Australians who smelled like the forest, moved like shadows, and carried the accumulated knowledge of the world's oldest surviving warrior tradition, were already watching his next recon element walk toward them. They were not in a hurry. They had learned that patience was the sharpest weapon available, and they had all the time the jungle required. All statistics regarding SASR operations in Vietnam, 1,200 patrols, 492 confirmed kills, kill ratios, and casualty figures, are drawn from Australian war memorial records and verified military histories. The operational doctrines described: movement speeds, scent elimination, Ho Chi Minh sandal use, weapon modifications, contact drill procedures, are documented in after-action reports, academic military history, and veteran accounts. The NVA general's response to his Recon company's destruction is reconstructed from documented patterns of enemy reaction to Australian SAS operations as recorded in captured enemy documents and post-war analysis. No individual NVA commander's identity has been specifically named in available sources for this incident. The encounter represents the verified pattern rather than a single confirmed event.